"Why are they asking for your ID?" Jake finally asked, his voice loud enough to catch the officer's attention. His tone was filled with curiosity and defensiveness, as if he were trying to protect his mother but didn't know how. "You didn't do anything wrong." The older officer glanced at Jake, but his expression remained flat, as if he saw no need to explain himself to a child. The younger officer appeared increasingly anxious, clearly uncomfortable with the growing distress of the children. Laura noticed this, but it did little to ease her own worries. She needed to defuse the situation before it escalated further. The older officer's patience seemed to be wearing thin. His gaze returned to Laura, and his hand now rested firmly on his hip, close to his handcuffs. "Mayim, you need to stop making this difficult. Show your ID, or we will have to take you in. We will let the police station sort it out." Laura's blood ran cold. The idea of being taken to the police station, especially in front of her children, terrified her. She had heard too many similar stories that ended in humiliation, violence, or worse. She couldn't let that happen, not in front of Jake and Ben. Laura took a deep breath, her mind racing. How far were these officers willing to go? Would they really arrest her without just cause? And if they did, what would happen to her children? Would they take the boys as well? The thought was agonizing. Laura's heart raced as she tried to think of her options. Legally, she had the right to refuse the officer's orders since she had committed no offense. However, the reality she faced was much more complicated. The law often did not favor justice, especially regarding race, and she could not risk her son's safety. The older officer stepped forward, clearly out of patience. "Last chance," he said in a low, threatening tone. "Identification now, or we will take you in." The world seemed to slow down. Laura, who usually never backed down from injustice, felt uncertain. As a judge, she had dedicated her life to fighting for the marginalized, who often became victims of the system. She knew all too well how racial discrimination harmed so many, treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. She was determined to do everything she could to combat that. But now, this was not just about her, it was about her children. Laura glanced at Ben, still clutching her leg, his small body trembling with fear. Jake stood beside him, gripping her hand tightly, trying to appear brave even though fear was evident in his eyes. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they knew enough to feel scared. Laura's heart ached for them. She had worked hard to create a safe and loving environment for her sons, shielding them from the harsh realities of the world for as long as possible. But now, all of that was crumbling before their eyes. How could she explain that the people who were supposed to protect them were now treating her like a criminal? Anger boiled within her. She wanted to fight back, to tell the officer what she thought of their veiled racism. But she knew anger wouldn't help. If she raised her voice or refused, the situation could spiral out of control. And at that moment, what would happen? Handcuffed in front of her children. They would see her taken away, and that trauma would haunt them for a lifetime. They would grow up with the memory of their mother being treated like a criminal simply because she was black. Laura couldn't let this happen, but could she just give up? Allowing these officers to humiliate her, to strip her of her dignity just to keep the peace. The thought made her nauseous. She was a judge, someone who had fought her entire life to be seen for who she was, not the color of her skin. How could she stand here and allow herself to be reduced to a stereotype? The older officer stepped closer, his expression hardening. His hand rested on the handcuffs, ready to act. Laura's heart raced. She pulled Ben closer. "You really want to force me, don't you?" she said, her voice low but firm. "You're not giving me a choice." Laura knew what would happen if she refused arrest. And after that, no one knew what would occur. "I'm their mother," she stated firmly, trying to keep her voice calm. "These are my children, and I haven't done anything wrong." The officer squinted, seeming to hesitate for a moment, but then hardened again. "We have to take you in," he said flatly. Laura's stomach felt heavy. Here it was, she was out of options. She glanced at her children, their faces filled with fear, and made a decision. It was time to reveal who she truly was. As the officer reached for the handcuffs, Laura took a deep breath. She knew that once she revealed her identity, everything would change. The tension in the air became palpable, the officer ready to follow through on his threat. Laura could feel control of the situation slipping away, and the cold stare of the officer assured her that this threat was not an empty one. She had to act quickly before things got worse. Or perhaps things would get even worse. Laura was on the verge of being detained. Her children might be taken away while she spent hours, maybe even days, trying to resolve this misunderstanding. As a black woman, she knew this would only worsen her situation in the eyes of the officers. The system had repeatedly shown her that people like her rarely received the benefit of the doubt. As the older officer moved closer, the younger officer glanced at his partner and then at Laura, clearly uneasy. From the beginning of the interaction, he hadn't said much, but Laura could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't entirely comfortable with what was happening, but he wasn't taking any action to stop it. His silence was as dangerous as his partner's aggression. The older officer's voice broke the silence, sharp and impatient. "Miss, if you don't provide your ID immediately, I will arrest you. I won't ask again." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of her children's gazes on her. Ben's hand trembled in hers, while Jake, though trying to stay calm, looked deeply shaken. The idea that her children would witness their mother being handcuffed sent waves of fear crashing over Laura. Ben, who had been holding her hand tightly throughout this ordeal, could no longer hold back his tears. His big round eyes were wet with tears, and his small body began to tremble uncontrollably. His fear was so palpable, radiating from him with a heartbreaking intensity. "Mom," he whimpered in a small, shaky voice. "Why are they being mean to you?" Laura knelt beside Ben, trying to shield him from the tension that weighed on them. She wrapped her arms around his small body, pulling him closer in an attempt to calm him, though she knew it was impossible to completely erase his fear. She gently wiped away Ben's tears, forcing herself to stay calm even as her own emotions began to overwhelm her. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered softly. "Everything will be all right. Stay close to mommy, okay?" But Ben's tears wouldn't stop, and Laura could feel his small body continue to shake. This injustice struck her deeply. Her innocent son was now afraid simply because of the color of his skin. Meanwhile, Jake was trying his hardest to stay brave, but Laura could see signs of panic on his face. His small hands clenched and unclenched as he struggled to understand the situation. His wide eyes were fixed on the officers, his mind wrestling with the injustice unfolding. "Why are you doing this to her?" Jake asked, his voice strong for his age. His question hung in the air, directed at the officers who had created this nightmare. Laura could see defiance in Jake's eyes, anger reflecting what he felt. Even at such a young age, Jake understood that this was wrong. However, the older officer showed no remorse. He didn't even glance at Jake, as if the child's words meant nothing. His focus remained on Laura, his expression cold and emotionless. The younger officer, on the other hand, looked increasingly uneasy, occasionally glancing at Jake before turning his gaze away again. "Miss, you need to stop making this more difficult," said the older officer, his voice cold and unsympathetic. "We're just trying to do our job and you refuse to cooperate." Laura could hardly believe the audacity of his words. She was the one being threatened, harassed, and suspected simply for being in public with her children. The injustice of this situation felt like a heavy weight on her chest, crushing her spirit. "Here's the translation of your text into English." Finally, the younger officer spoke, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we should give her a little time. She's with her kids, perhaps we can." However, the older officer immediately cut him off with a sharp glare. His jaw clenched. "We've already given her plenty of chances. She's being uncooperative, and we have protocols to follow." Laura's frustration boiled over. How could a peaceful outing with her children turn into a nightmare like this? She could see it in their eyes: disbelief, suspicion, the assumption that she was at fault simply because she was black and her children were white. They didn't trust her. They didn't care about the truth. The older officer stepped even closer, the threat of arrest becoming more real. "Mom, we're done talking. Give us your identification, or we will have to take you in. You could explain yourself at the police station." Time felt like it was slowing down for Laura as she considered her options. Every choice felt heavier and more difficult. She could simply hand over her ID, hoping that would satisfy their warped sense of justice. But she knew that even if she complied with their orders, her dignity wouldn't just vanish. The humiliation she felt now wouldn't strip her of her self-worth. Everything she had fought for would feel futile if she yielded to unjust demands. However, if she refused, the risks were much greater. The image of herself being led away in handcuffs while her children cried and screamed for her was a sight she couldn't shake from her mind. Leaving them alone in the care of these officers, with the looming uncertainty and fear, made her feel physically ill. Her hands balled at her sides as the anger she knew so well simmered inside her. As a black woman, injustice was not unfamiliar to her. It had been a part of her life. Yet each time it occurred, it still hurt just as deeply. The burden was always equally heavy. Laura had risen time and again, working hard to prove she was more than society assumed. But today, this was not just about her. This was about her children, about their innocence, about how they viewed the world. She looked at her children again, her heart breaking at their fear. They didn't deserve this. They shouldn't have to witness their mother being treated this way. They shouldn't learn so early that the world could be so unjust. The thought of them growing up with this memory haunted Laura. She was a mother, and at that moment, that role outweighed everything. As much as she wanted to fight, to stand her ground, she knew she couldn't let this situation worsen, not for her own sake, but for her children's. Yet even as she reached this decision, her anger remained unquenched. It simmered beneath the surface, a fire that could not be extinguished. There was nothing fair about this situation. But here she was, forced to choose between preserving her dignity and protecting her children. Her children. Laura's thoughts raced as she considered every possibility. She knew that revealing her identity as a judge would change the dynamic of the situation, but that was not a card she wanted to play lightly. There was always the risk that her position would only exacerbate the situation, making the officers feel more threatened and defensive. But time was running out. The older officer was not going to wait any longer. He moved closer, grabbing Laura's arm, ready to cuff her. "Turn around," he said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "You're under arrest." The world felt like it was tilting on its axis as Laura realized the moment she had dreaded had arrived. This was no longer a hypothetical threat, it was real. Her beautiful, innocent children would see their mother handcuffed and taken away like a criminal. The thought made her stomach churn. Ben's sobs grew louder as he clung to Laura's legs, refusing to let go. "Don't, Mom. Don't let them take you." Jake, though appearing braver, looked close to tears, his small fists clenched as he stood in front of his mother, trying to protect her. Seeing her children in such a state was the breaking point for Laura. Before the officer could cuff her, she took a deep breath and spoke in a calm yet firm voice, filled with the authority she had earned through years of hard work. "I'm a judge," she said as she pulled out her identification badge and held it up for the officers to see. "I'm a judge of the Civil Rights Court, specifically handling cases of discrimination against black citizens. You are making a serious mistake." Her words hung in the air, laden with the weight of the meanings they carried. The older officer froze, his hand still hovering near Laura's arm. His eyes widened slightly as realization began to dawn. He hadn't expected this. Based on his assumptions, he thought Laura was just another black woman who needed to be controlled. The younger officer's face paled, and he glanced nervously at his partner, unsure of what to do. Laura could see panic starting to creep onto their faces as they realized they had gone too far. In the ongoing silence, Laura's heart raced. She had revealed her identity, and in that instant, the power dynamics shifted. But she knew this wasn't over. The officers were still processing what had just happened, still grappling with the consequences of their actions. Despite feeling shaken, Laura wouldn't let them off the hook. As her words began to settle, Laura continued to hold her badge, stretched out in her hand. Emotions swirled within her: relief, fear, anger, and frustration, all mixing together as she tried to remain calm. Her heart still pounded as if it were hammering against her ribs, but her face remained composed. Although every nerve in her body was tense, this wasn't how she wanted it to be. Laura didn't want to play the role of the judge, let alone use her position to escape an unjust situation. She had always taken pride in standing tall against adversity, fighting prejudice without using her status as a shield. But now it seemed she had no other choice. As she displayed her badge, she felt a change. The faces of the officers, particularly the younger one, reflected shock. His eyes widened, his mouth slightly agape. Clearly, they hadn't expected this. For a moment, Laura felt as if revealing her identity compromised her integrity, but the situation was already out of control. This was no longer about her, it was about protecting her children. She had to ensure their safety and that they wouldn't carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. Even though she had played her trump card, Laura knew the real battle had just begun. The older officer glared at her with a look of anger and confusion. He hadn't expected this outcome, and now had to face the reality that the woman he suspected and belittled had authority to hold him accountable for his actions. The silence between them felt heavy, the tension palpable. Laura could feel the weight of her children's gazes, waiting for her to lead them through this storm. However, despite the changing circumstances, the older officer wasn't ready to back down. His pride and authority were at stake, and admitting fault wasn't an option for him. Laura could see his stubbornness, his jaw tightened as he tried to maintain control. "So, you're a judge," the officer spoke in a low but tense tone, as if it were difficult for him to utter those words. "That doesn't mean you're above the law. We're just doing our job, Ma. I am." Laura's jaw clenched, but she kept her tone calm. "No one is above the law, especially not me. But your actions today aren't about enforcing the law, they're about something else." Laura's voice sounded steady, but there was an assertiveness that made the younger officer fidget. The older officer squinted, his hand still close to his cuffs. Laura could sense that he wouldn't let this go without a fight. His ego was bruised, and men like him didn't like to be challenged, especially by a black woman. He stepped closer, his posture aggressive. We received reports of suspicious activity in this area. 2 white children with a black woman. Our job is to ensure everything is in order. You may be a judge, but we have protocols to follow. Laura felt her anger flare again, but she tried to rein it in. This officer wasn't just enforcing the law, he wanted to assert his dominance, to emphasize that, regardless of her status, Laura still had to submit to his authority. You're not following protocol, Laura said firmly. You're following prejudice. I have the right to walk with my children without being harassed. You have no legitimate reason to stop me, but look where we are now. The older officer's eyes darkened. It was clear he wasn't used to being spoken to this way. Laura knew she had reached a critical point. You're obstructing an investigation, the officer said coldly. We can still arrest you, judge or not. You're not cooperating. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Laura could see from the older officer's body language that he was ready to escalate the situation. His shoulders were stiff, and his hands remained close to his belt, ready to react at a moment's notice if Laura pushed too far. His authority had been challenged, and he wasn't about to let it go easily. Laura's heart raced as she considered her next move. She didn't want to give the officer a reason to act, but she also couldn't let him think she was at a disadvantage. She was a judge, and she had the right to defend herself and her children. Laura glanced at her kids. Jake still had his fists clenched, his face red with anger, while Ben had stopped crying, but sadness still shone in his eyes. Their eyes were wide open, filled with fear and confusion. They looked at Laura, searching for guidance. She had to be strong for them, but also cautious. The officer's patience was wearing thin as he stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with almost uncontrollable anger. This is your last warning, miss. Show us your ID, or we will arrest you. Laura swallowed hard, realizing the man wasn't bluffing. If she didn't comply, he would indeed arrest her, and the image of herself being handcuffed in front of her children was more than she could bear. Yet she wouldn't let it happen without a fight. Taking a deep breath, Laura made a decision. She needed to defuse the situation before it got worse, but she also had to stand firm. There was no room for fear after everything she had been through. Slowly, Laura reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. She felt the officer's gaze on her, watching her every move as if he were waiting for her to do something wrong. Laura retrieved her driver's license and extended it, her hand steady. Here's my ID, she said calmly yet firmly. Now you know who I am. And I hope you understand that you've made a serious mistake. The older officer took the ID, glancing at it quickly. A flicker of recognition crossed his eyes, a realization that Laura was telling the truth. He handed the ID back, his face remaining stern, but there was a new tension in his expression, uncertainty. The younger officer, sensing the shift, finally stepped forward. Maybe we should let this go, he said quietly, his voice almost inaudible. I mean, she's a judge. Perhaps we should. The older officer shot him a sharp look, cutting off his words, but the doubt was already there. Laura could see it. The officer's authority had been challenged, and now he was grappling with how to proceed. Arresting Laura would mean risking his career, but backing down would mean admitting his mistake, something he clearly wasn't accustomed to. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Laura held her breath, waiting for the officer's next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the older officer stepped back. His jaw was clenched, his face flushed with anger and frustration. But he didn't reach for his handcuffs. Instead, he glared at Laura, his eyes filled with contempt. You can go, he said through clenched teeth. But don't think this is over. We will file a report. Laura wasn't surprised. This was the closest thing to a victory she would get today. The officer's pride had been wounded, but Laura knew it wasn't wise to push further. Go ahead, she said calmly. Though adrenaline still coursed through her body. I'll file my own report too. The officer's eyes darkened, but he didn't say anything more. He turned and walked to the patrol car, followed by the younger officer. The young officer stole a glance at Laura with an apologetic expression before getting into the car without another word. As the vehicle drove away, Laura exhaled shakily. The confrontation was over, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to comfort her children, who were still standing nearby, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. Laura turned to her kids. Jake still looked angry, his small hands clenched at his sides. Meanwhile, Ben, usually cheerful, was silent, his gaze fixed on the spot where the officers had stood moments ago. Laura knelt before them, hugging her children tightly, pulling them closer. "It's all okay now," she whispered gently but firmly. But deep down, Laura knew that wasn't entirely true. The incident may have ended, but the scars it left on her children would take time to heal. She could see it in Jake's eyes: anger, confusion, and a sense of betrayal. And in Ben's trembling hands, the lingering fear after the encounter. They might be too young to fully understand what had happened, but they were old enough to know that something was very wrong. As she embraced them, Laura knew this moment would be etched in their memories for a long time. For her, it wasn't an easy moment to forget. But as she stood there with her children, her mind began to shift. The confrontation may have been over, but the lesson wasn't just about the officers needing to understand their mistakes. They needed to know that their actions weren't only wrong, they were a violation of rights, a reflection of the prejudice still deeply rooted in this system. She wouldn't let this go unaddressed. Not this time. There would be consequences, and she would ensure the officers understood that their acts of consciousness and suspicion had an impact. That lesson would stay with them for a long time. As the police car disappeared down the street, Laura stood still for a moment, her arms protectively wrapped around her children. Her heart was still racing, and her mind was busy with everything that had just happened. But she knew this wasn't over, far from it. The confrontation might have ended, but the impact of the officers' actions hadn't fully unfolded yet. Slowly, Laura released her embrace from Jake and Ben. She knelt down to look into their eyes. "Are you both okay?" she asked gently, brushing Jake's hair from his forehead. Jake's face was still filled with anger and confusion. His small hands were clenched tightly by his sides, unable to let go of what had just happened. "Why were they so mean, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling, a mix of frustration and fear. "We didn't do anything wrong, but they treated you like a criminal." Ben, who remained silent and shaken, just nodded in agreement. His eyes glistened, filled with tears he could no longer hold back. He looked at his mother, trying to understand the fear and confusion that had enveloped her throughout the ordeal. Laura felt a lump in her throat. How could she explain something so complex and profound as racism to her young children? They were too young to comprehend the system that fueled the officers' actions, but she knew this was an important moment, their first experience facing racial prejudice directly. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for this difficult conversation. "You're right, Jake. We didn't do anything wrong," she said calmly. "What those officers did was wrong. They saw us, saw me, and made assumptions based solely on our skin color. They didn't care about the truth. They let their prejudices govern their actions." But why? Jake's voice broke, the hurt and confusion clear in his eyes. "Why did they do that to you? You're a judge, you help people." Laura nodded, feeling the pain of that injustice. Sometimes people let fear and ignorance control how they see the world. The officers saw a black woman with 2 white children, and instead of treating us with respect, they assumed the worst. They let their prejudices take over. Ben shifted closer to Laura, seeking comfort. "But you stopped them, right?" he asked softly. Laura hugged Ben tightly, her heart swelling with pride for her children's courage and innocence. "Yes, sweetheart, I stopped them, and I will make sure they learn from this. What they did was wrong, and people like that need to understand that their actions have consequences." Jake wiped his eyes, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. "Will they get in trouble?" Laura's expression hardened slightly. "They will. I will file a formal complaint about what happened. They need to understand that their behavior was not only unfair but also illegal. I will make sure they know that." Her voice was calm but filled with conviction. She wouldn't let this go unchallenged. The officers had crossed a line, and as a judge, she had the power to hold them accountable. As a mother, she also had the responsibility to ensure her children understood that justice could and should be upheld. Meanwhile, inside the police car driving away, the atmosphere among the officers was tense. The older officer gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. His jaw was clenched, and his face flushed with a mix of anger and frustration. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself, but the earlier confrontation troubled his mind. He hadn't expected that woman to be a judge, someone with power who could fight back. Now the reality was beginning to sink in, and guilt gnawed at him. Next to him, the young officer sat in silence, his face pale and weary. He hadn't spoken since they left the scene, but his mind raced. He couldn't shake the image of the woman standing there, with her frightened and confused children as they threatened to arrest her. He knew they had crossed a line. He could feel it deep in his heart, but he didn't have the courage to say it at the time. The weight of their actions pressed down on him, and guilt began to feel like bile in his throat. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Do you think we went too far back there?" The older officer shot him a sharp look, his lips thinning into a tight line. "We were just doing our job," he replied firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate. "We were just responding to a call." She wasn't cooperating, so he had to take control of the situation even as the words left his mouth. The older officer felt a void in his heart. He knew what had happened wasn't just about doing his duty. He let his biases cloud his judgment, and now it haunted him. The younger officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's a judge. We could be in big trouble for the way we handled this." The older officer tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching harder. He didn't respond immediately. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. He knew the younger officer was right. They had mishandled this situation, and now they were at risk of facing serious consequences. But admitting that mistake to himself or anyone else was not something he was ready to do. Meanwhile, at home, Laura was still grappling with the simmering anger inside her. She knew she had done the right thing, but the injustice of the situation weighed heavily on her mind. She wanted the officers to understand the impact of their actions, not just on her but also on her children. The trauma they caused wouldn't easily fade away. As night fell and her children fell asleep, Laura sat at her desk. With her laptop open, her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She began to write a formal complaint, noting every detail of the incident. Her words were meticulous and clear, ensuring that every fact was indisputable. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself, it was also about making sure that the officer and others like him were held accountable for their actions. After finishing, Laura leaned back in her chair. Her mind was still racing. The injustice she faced was something that many black people encountered every day. Yet as a judge, she had a platform and a voice that could make a difference. She wouldn't stop with just a complaint. She would push for change, advocating for a system that truly protects everyone, regardless of their skin color. A few days later, as the older officer sat in his office, a thick envelope was delivered to his desk. His name was neatly printed on the front, but as soon as he saw the sender's address, his stomach churned. The envelope came from the court. A formal complaint had been filed against him. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, fear twisting in his gut. The contents were clear. He had overstepped his authority, acted out of bias, and threatened to arrest a judge without just cause. Every sentence in the document was a reminder of the mistakes he had made. The younger officer sitting nearby glanced at him, noting the tension in his face. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly, though he could already guess what was in the envelope. The older officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the complaint in his hand, his mind racing with the potential repercussions: disciplinary action, suspension, or even worse. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had made a serious mistake, and now there was no way to escape the consequences. Finally, he looked at his partner, his voice heavy with regret. "We're in trouble," he said succinctly. The younger officer nodded, his face grim. He knew this was coming, but hearing those words made everything feel more real. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and they would face the consequences of their actions. As time passed, the burden of the mistake began to weigh heavier on both officers. The older officer often replayed the events in his mind, unable to erase the image of Laura's face, how she stood her ground, how she presented her identity with calm authority. He had misjudged her, just as he had misjudged so many people before. But this time, there were real consequences, and he could no longer ignore his actions. The formal complaint continued to haunt him, a reminder that his career was now hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, the younger officer also wrestled with his guilt. Deep down, he knew from the start that what they were doing was wrong, but he didn't speak up, he didn't stop it. Now, they both had to face the consequences. The complaint filed by Laura was not just a personal grievance, but a catalyst for a larger investigation into the officer's behavior. As news of the incident spread, the police department launched a formal investigation, and the officers found themselves under scrutiny like never before. Their superiors were unhappy, and it quickly became clear that their actions had jeopardized their careers. For the older officer, the weight of the consequences felt immense. He had spent years building his career, and now it was all crumbling because of one encounter. Yet he could no longer deny the truth. He had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment, and now he had to accept the repercussions. For the younger officer, his guilt was almost unbearable. He had remained silent, doing nothing as the situation escalated when he should have spoken up. Now, as the investigation continued, he realized that his silence had destroyed him. Both officers were suspended while the investigation was ongoing, their reputations tarnished, and their futures uncertain. But for Laura, this was just the beginning. The consequences for the officers were merely the first step. There was still much to be done to change a system that had allowed such behavior to persist for so long. As she stepped into a new chapter of her life, Laura knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and she was ready to continue, no matter how long it took. The evening sun began to set, casting warm orange hues around the neighborhood as Laura walked home with Jake and Ben by her side. Although the immediate danger had passed, the weight of the event still lingered in the air, following them like a shadow. Laura's thoughts were a mix of relief, anger, and sadness. She had managed to protect her children from the worst, but the scars from that encounter would not be easily erased. As they approached their home, the children remained silent. Ben still held her hand tightly, his eyes appearing tired as if he hadn't fully grasped what had happened. Jake, on the other hand, walked quietly with a determined look on his face, his earlier anger still simmering beneath the surface. They were both processing the incident in their own ways, and Laura knew it would take time for them to truly understand. Once inside the house, Laura felt a comforting sense of safety, even though it was tinged with the bitter reality that the earlier incident had intruded into what should have been her sanctuary. She knelt down, pulling her two sons into a tight embrace. "We're home now," she whispered softly, trying to reassure them. "We're safe." Ben buried his face in Laura's shoulder, his small body still trembling. "I was so scared, Mom," he murmured quietly. "Why were they so mean?" Jake, standing slightly taller, stared at the floor, his face marked with frustration. "They shouldn't have done that. It's not fair." Laura sighed softly. She knew this was just the beginning of a long conversation. All this time, she had tried to shield her children from the harsher realities of the world, but today that illusion had shattered. They had witnessed the ugliness of prejudice firsthand, and now it was her duty to help them understand it all. She led them to the sofa and sat with them, hugging them both tightly. "You're right, Jake. It's not fair," she said gently. "What the officers did was wrong, and I will make sure they are held accountable. But I also want you to know, not everyone is like them. There are good people who treat others with respect and kindness, but sometimes we have to fight for that." Jake looked at his mother, his eyes filled with questions. "But why do we have to fight? Why can't people just be fair?" That question pierced Laura's heart. How could she explain the racism and systemic prejudice that had existed for centuries to her children? How could she help them understand that the fight for justice was far from over? "Sometimes people don't know what's right," Laura replied slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes they grow up with wrong ideas about others, and they let those thoughts influence their actions. But that doesn't mean what they do is right. That's why we have to keep standing up for what is right, even when it's hard." The furrows on Jake's brow deepened, his young mind struggling to comprehend the injustice he had witnessed. "But Mom, you're a judge. They should listen to you. Why didn't they?" Laura felt a pang as she heard that question. She could see the confusion and anger in her son's eyes, and she knew this moment would shape their view of the world for years to come. Jake had seen that authority doesn't always align with justice, a bitter truth that was hard for even adults to grasp, let alone children. They didn't listen because their prejudices got in the way. "They made assumptions about me just because of my skin color," Laura explained gently. "They didn't want to see who I really am, but that won't make me give up. I will keep fighting, not just for us, but for everyone who experiences similar injustice." Ben, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke, his voice small but firm. "Will they go to jail for what they did?" Laura shook her head slightly. "No, they probably won't go to jail, but they will face consequences for their actions. What they did was wrong, and I will make sure people know about it. More importantly, I will continue working to change the system so this doesn't happen again." Jake leaned against her, trying to process everything. "I don't like them, Mom. I don't like people who are that mean." Laura hugged him tightly, her feelings a mix of pride and sadness. "I know, sweetheart, I don't like them either. But the most important thing is not to let their cruelty make us angry or bitter. We must keep our hearts kind and strong, even when the world is unfair. That's how we can make things better." Laura could feel her children starting to relax a little. The warmth of their home provided a temporary refuge from the storm they had just faced. However, she knew this conversation wasn't over. It was just the beginning of their understanding of the world, and she would be there to guide them every step of the way. While Laura comforted her children at home, the two officers struggled with the impact of their actions. The older officer sat at his desk in the police station, unable to shake the fear that had enveloped him since the confrontation. He tried to convince himself that he was just doing his job, following protocol, but deep down he knew that wasn't the whole story. His partner, the younger officer, had been silent during the ride back. His face was pale, his eyes empty. He hadn't said much since they parted ways. His discomfort was evident. Sitting across from the older officer, he finally broke the silence. "We messed up," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Did you see her badge? She's a judge. We could lose our jobs over this." The older officer's jaw tightened. He didn't want to admit it, but the younger officer was right. They had crossed a line, and now they were facing the consequences. The formal complaint filed against them was the first step, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Their reputations were at stake, as were their careers. "I know," the older officer finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "We should have handled this differently, but now it's too late to change what happened." The younger officer furrowed his brow, worried. "Do you think we'll get fired?" The older officer didn't answer immediately, staring at his trembling hands, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Years of his career were now at risk because of one encounter, which revealed the biases and mistakes within him. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but one thing's for sure. We have to take responsibility for what we've done." As time went on, a formal investigation into the officer's actions began. The complaint Laura filed quickly drew attention. Soon after, high-ranking officials in the police department ordered a thorough review of their conduct. The media also started to cover the story, reporting on the incident, highlighting the officer's actions, and raising questions about racial misconduct in law enforcement. For Laura, this process was exhausting but also empowering. She anticipated pushback but didn't expect her case to attract such public attention. It seemed many people were tired of seeing repeated injustices. Her complaint became a symbol for those wanting to see real reform in how law enforcement dealt with racial issues. While focusing on her case, Laura made sure to care for her family. Jake and Ben slowly began to process what had happened, and Laura ensured they always had space to discuss their feelings. She wanted them to understand that, even though the world isn't always fair, they have the power to stand up for what is right. As the investigation continued, Laura received news from her lawyer that both officers were suspended without pay pending the investigation's outcome. It was a small step, but it was in the right direction. Laura knew real change would take time, but she was determined to keep fighting. Weeks later, rumors spread that the officers might face more serious consequences. All of this began with decisions made in a prejudiced state of mind. The young officer was still haunted by guilt for allowing the incident to happen. He began to evaluate his role in law enforcement. He had joined the police force to make a difference, to help people, but now he wasn't sure if he was part of the solution or part of the problem. His encounter with Laura forced him to confront the biases within himself, and the reflection that followed felt uncomfortable but was crucial for both men. The impact of their actions was a loud wake-up call. They thought they were just doing their jobs, but now they had to face the reality that their behavior had real and profound consequences, not only for their careers but also for the lives of the people they hurt. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Laura took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The struggle for justice was ongoing, and she knew her fight was not over. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a new sense of purpose, a determination to carry on, no matter how difficult it might be. She had stood firm in the face of prejudice, and she had won. More than that, she had shown her children that they could be strong even when the world seemed to be against them. She had taught them the importance of standing up for what is right, regardless of the cost to be paid. As she sat at her desk, preparing for the next day in court, Laura glanced out the window, watching the sun begin to set. In the horizon, the outside world was still full of challenges, far from perfect, but she was ready to face it. Laura knew that the fight for justice was not just about a single moment or a single encounter, it was a lifelong commitment. She was prepared to continue fighting for her children, her community, and their future. They all deserved it. Thank you for following this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the latest episodes. Leave a comment, we truly value your opinion. And be sure to check out our other videos. Each story will make you think and inspire you to change. Click on one now.